In the brutal heat of the Kansas summer in 1878, when the sky stretched like a taut canvas of fire over the prairie, and the wind carried more dust than comfort, 47 people in Harper County died of what was officially recorded as typhoid fever, though no case before or since has ever mimicked what took place that season. And no explanation has been satisfactory enough to settle the bones of those who died, or to silence the questions that continue to hang like cobwebs in the minds of those who dare to remember. Because among the dead and the grieving, 4 brothers lived, untouched, unmoved, immune, or perhaps chosen, though by whom or for has never been conclusively known. And if it ever was known, those who knew are long since dead or silenced or worse. The Blackwood brothers, Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel were not forgotten in Harper County. They were erased, and there is a difference, because forgetting is the natural erosion of memory by time, while erasure is deliberate, violent, done with intent and fear, and that's exactly what happened after the events of that cursed year, when the Methodist Church of Cedar Ridge burned every page, every entry, every baptism and prayer that bore the Blackwood name, and the Kansas State Medical Board, acting under authority no one could later identify, sealed every record, every diagnosis, every physician's note, and even the burial details of the dead, as if the very mention of the Blackwoods threatened the fabric of what people still wanted to believe about the world, that it was ordered, explainable, ruled either by a benevolent God or by natural law, but never both, and never neither. What happened to the Blackwood brothers is not simply a story of 4 men surviving a plague. It is not a story of miracle or medicine or coincidence. And if you are listening to this with curiosity alone, I suggest you stop, because the truth does not satisfy curiosity. It destroys it. And once you've heard what really happened on that isolated farm outside Cedar Ridge, once you understand the nature of their transformation and what they became, you cannot unknow it, and you will never look at the sunrise or the silence of a rural evening the same way again, because this is not a ghost story. It is not even a horror story. It is something older, colder, and much more real. The official records begin with death, as they often do, but the real story begins with survival, and not just survival, but something worse, something deeper, something that moved against the grain of life itself, because the Blackwoods did. Not just survive the outbreak, they thrived during it. Their fields stood green when others browned and wilted. Their cattle grew fat while neighboring herds thinned to bone. And their chapel on the hill, constructed with their own hands from limestone and timber, rang with hymns even as the church in town fell silent, its pews empty, its congregants buried or too afraid to gather. At first, people in Cedar Ridge took this as a sign of divine favor. The Blackwoods had always been pious, overly so by many accounts, and their refusal to attend the Methodist church in town had long been a subject of whispered debate. But when their isolation appeared to shield them from the creeping death that swept through the community, some began to believe that perhaps their way was the right way, that perhaps they were being protected for their devotion, and a few even made the Himosia journey out to the Blackwood farm, desperate and trembling, seeking prayer or guidance or even sanctuary, but most returned away at the gate, politely but firmly, and told that the brothers were not accepting visitors at that time, that they were in a season of deep spiritual retreat, and those who insisted were met not with anger, but with a calm, quiet firmness that unsettled more than any shout could have done. The first person to suggest that something was wrong with the brothers was a boy, no more than 10, who claimed that when he and his father delivered lumber to the Blackwood property in early July, he had seen something strange in the way the brothers stood in the field. Not working, not talking, just standing in a perfect square, facing each other, unmoving, as if caught in silent communion, and when he called out to them, none responded, not even to look his way. And when he looked into the eyes of the eldest, Ezra, he said it was like looking into a frozen pond in winter, clear and deep and empty, like nothing was behind them but light and ice and silence. His father slapped him for making up such stories and made him swear never to repeat it. But the boy never forgot, and years later, long after the farm had been abandoned and the chapel had collapsed under the weight of time and wind, he returned, as a man to stand in that same field, and he swore the grass still refused to grow in the square where the brothers had stood. But let's go back to the beginning. Before the outbreak, before the fever, before the whispers and the deaths and the cover-up, because to understand what happened, you must first understand who the Blackwoods were, and why they came to Kansas, and what they hoped to find in a land that offered nothing but wind and wheat and sky. They arrived in the spring of 1872, 4 brothers with solemn faces and black beards, driving 2 covered wagons filled with tools, books, and a single organ carefully wrapped in canvas, and they bought 640 acres with cash from the estate of their father, a strict and silent man who had died of a sudden stroke in Clinton County, Ohio, leaving behind no debts and no affection, just a stern will and a lifetime of unfinished prayers. Ezra, the eldest, was 36 when they arrived, tall and broad with a quiet authority that did not demand obedience but received it anyway. His eyes were pale blue, unnaturally so, and those who met him often found themselves speaking less and thinking more, as if his gaze rearranged their thoughts into order and judgment, and he rarely spoke except to answer direct questions. But when he did, it was with a clarity and certainty that left no room for argument. Caleb, 2 years younger, was the practical mind, the one who kept the ledgers and tracked the crops, who calculated rainfall and crop yields and livestock growth with mathematical precision that bordered on obsession. He saw God in numbers, in patterns, in the harmony of cycles, and he kept journals filled with equations and geometric drawings alongside biblical passages, as if seeking the proof of faith in the language of math. Josiah, at 31, was the scholar, the one who had tasted the outside world and returned changed. He had studied theology and medicine at Ohio Wesleyan University before being called home by duty, and he brought with him over 200 books, many of them worn and annotated, ranging from anatomy to Hebrew mysticism, from Greek philosophy to obscure Protestant sermons, and his room in the farmhouse looked more like a library than a bedroom, the walls lined with shelves and boxes and scrolls, his mind forever reaching outward and inward at the same time. Abel, the youngest at 25, was fire and hunger and fervor, a man so consumed by his faith that he often wept during prayer, fasted for days until his body shook, and claimed to hear voices not of madness but of spirit. And though his brothers sometimes looked at him with concern, they never doubted his sincerity, only feared the direction of his devotion. And it was Abel who first suggested they build a chapel, not in town, but on their own land, on the highest hill facing the east, so that every morning the rising sun would pass through the tall windows and illuminate the altar with golden light. They built that chapel with their own hands, shaping limestone from their creek bed and timber from their woods, carving pews from walnut and inlaying the altar with Hebrew inscriptions Josiah had transcribed from his sacred texts. And every Sunday they held their own service, following a primitive Methodist tradition stripped of ornament and focused on revelation. And they prayed not as a performance, but as a transaction, offering themselves in exchange for truth, for clarity, for understanding of the divine geometry that they believed governed both soul and soil. Their days followed a rhythm of labor and liturgy, rising at 4 for silent prayer, working the fields until midday, caring for animals and machinery. In the afternoon, and dedicating every evening to study, to discussion, to shared revelations spoken in the hush of their candlelit chapel, and they lived alone, married to the land and to God and to each other. bound not by blood alone, but by purpose, by something deeper that even they could not name. The people of Cedar Ridge respected them, feared them a little, admired their productivity and their discipline, but did not understand them, and the brothers never tried to explain themselves, never joined the harvest dances or the winter socials, never drank at the saloon or lingered at the general store. They came to town every 2 weeks, bought what they needed, and left without conversation, and the town came to accept their presence like a natural feature of the land, like a distant thunder that never quite became a storm. But something changed in the summer of 1878, something subtle at first, a heaviness in the air, a stillness in the fields, the birds quieter, the nights longer, and when the fever came, it came fast, and it came wrong, and the Blackwoods did not run, did not hide, did not sicken. They watched, they prayed, and when the time came, they stepped forward, not to save, but to offer themselves. And what happened next cannot be understood with science or scripture, only with silence, the kind that fills a chapel at midnight when the prayers have ended and something else begins to speak. The land was flat for miles, a prairie horizon so vast it seemed to press against the sky like a closed lid. The grasses swayed with the pulse of the wind like a breathing animal, wild and silent, except for the low hum of cicadas and the groan of old timber in the wind. Cedar Ridge was not a place people found by accident. It was carved into the Kansas wilderness by men who believed hardship was a form of devotion, a test administered by God himself. 300 souls had settled there by 1870, most of them Methodists or Baptists, most of them carrying the weight of loss from the war, from failed crops, from children buried in wooden boxes beneath the brittle earth. They had come west not because they were brave, but because they were desperate. And desperate people build things that look like courage. From a distance, there were no paved roads, only rutted paths that turned to black rivers of mud when the rain came. And the rain did come, cruel and short and fierce. Like a punishment, the houses were built from limestone or hand-hewn oak, small and square, thick-walled to trap the warmth from the cast-iron stoves within. The air smelled of dung and firewood, of smoke and wet canvas, of the labor of men who had stopped asking why life hurt and had learned instead to brace against it, to endure it. In silence. At the center of Cedar Ridge stood the chapel, whitewashed and rigid, built on a rise of land so that its steeple could be seen from every direction, not for pride, but as a reminder. Inside the pews were narrow and unvarnished, the altar unadorned. There were no icons, no statues, just a heavy Bible bound in cracked leather, and a cross hung slightly askew above the pulpit. Reverend Elijah Griggs preached every Sunday with a voice that rose like smoke, full of wrath and scripture. He had buried 3 wives and 7 children before he ever arrived in Cedar Ridge, and he never once spoke of them, not to anyone. The community did not gossip. They did not drink openly. They did not dance or sing or touch one another more than was necessary. Affection was seen as vanity, and vanity was sin. Even laughter was reserved. Measured like grain in a famine, they believed the prairie was holy because it was unforgiving, and that suffering was the price of righteousness. Men worked from before sunrise to after dark. Women bled and bore and buried. Children learned to speak softly and die quickly. It was not cruelty. It was simply the way of things. Strangers were rare, and when they came, they were watched carefully, measured not by their words, but by their calluses, their posture, the way they chewed their food, or met another man's eyes. Most didn't stay, not because they weren't welcome, but because they couldn't stand the silence, the weight of the land pressing in from all sides like a second sky. You had to be made of something brittle and iron to last there, something that cracked instead of bending. It was into this world that the Blackwood brothers arrived, though no one remembered seeing their wagon come through the town. No one saw them pitch their tents or raise their house, One day, there was a field of waist-high grass, and the next, there was a cabin, square and clean and quiet, built of stone and oak like the others, but set apart. To the west of town, near the edge of the cottonwood grove, they didn't come to the chapel, didn't greet neighbors, didn't ask for seed or tools. They didn't need to. They brought everything with them. At first, people whispered, wondering if they were Catholics or Jews or some heretic breed that prayed to a different god. But when no fire struck them down and no plague followed them, the whispers faded, replaced by a wary tolerance. They weren't unfriendly, just different. The kind of different that makes you forget them when they aren't standing right in front of you. Not out of malice, but because your mind has nowhere to put them, no shelf to rest them on. The land around their homestead changed quickly. The soil, which had refused to grow anything but sorghum and crabgrass for years, suddenly turned black and wet and rich. Their fields bloomed with crops out of season. Their cattle grew fat even. Through the winter, some said it was because they worked harder than others, that they used special fertilizer or irrigation techniques brought from back east. But those who had tried to spy on their methods came back confused or didn't come back at all. One boy who wandered too close claimed he heard voices coming from the barn long after dark, voices speaking in Latin or something older, something wet and broken. He stammered when he tried to describe it, and eventually his father beat the story out of him until he forgot it entirely. Their names were known but not often spoken. Ezra the oldest, Caleb the silent one, Josiah the one with books, and Abel the one who sang to himself while he walked barefoot across their fields at dusk. They never cut their beards, never smiled, never bought from the general store or haggled over prices. They paid in coin, real coin, heavy in silver, and stamped with dates that made no sense. 1832, 1799, 1664, coins that felt colder than they should, and seemed to hum faintly if you held them too long. Some said they were brothers in blood. Others believed they were bound by something older than blood, a vow or covenant, a pact etched into skin or bone. No one knew for sure, and no one asked, when a man wears his faith in silence and his gaze. Like a mirror, you don't ask him what he believes. You wait and watch and hope he never notices you watching. The land around them changed, but the town did not. The church remained the axis of all thought and all law, and those who lived by its rhythm continued to do so, though sometimes they hesitated before kneeling to pray, or dreamed of fields that whispered their names, or felt their children's hands grow cold for no reason, cold like stone left in shadow. There was something in the air, a tension like the moments before lightning strikes, like the pause between a scream and its echo. No one could name it, not even Reverend Griggs, though his sermons grew harsher, more frantic, full of fire and blood and the wrath of God, as if he were trying to drown out a sound only he could hear. Cedar Ridge was not a place where change came easily, and when it did come, it came like a scythe, fast and final. But this change was slower, more subtle, like water wearing down stone. It came in dreams, in lost time, in children waking up, with bloodless fingers and women miscarrying without knowing they were pregnant, in dogs that refused to bark in the direction of the Blackwood farm, and cows that turned their eyes away from the western fields. By the spring of 1875, a thin layer of ash began to appear on the eastern edge of town each morning. No fire had been seen, no smoke smelled, but the ash was there, pale and fine and clinging to the windowsills like frost. Reverend Griggs declared it a test, a sign of the devil's envy, and told his flock to ignore it. But he began sleeping in the chapel, clutching the Bible to his chest, muttering prayers with his eyes open. Then came the night of silence, April 3rd, 1875, when the wind stopped entirely. Not a breeze, not a whisper. Even the insects went still, and the sky turned a color that wasn't black, but something deeper, like ink and water, and not a single person in Cedar Ridge slept, though none remembered why, and none spoke of it afterward. It was after that night that the birds stopped nesting near the Blackwood farm. After that night that Reverend Griggs burned his journals and locked himself in the bell tower for 3 days. After that night that the soil in the town graveyard turned sour and bloated, pushing bones to the surface like secrets too long buried. Something was wrong in Cedar Ridge, and everyone felt it, but no one said it, because saying it would make it real. And there are things so terrible that they only exist if you give them shape with your tongue, if you let them out into the air where they can take root. So the town endured, as it always had, silent and stoic, and trembling beneath the surface like a body with a hidden wound, while just beyond the cottonwood grove, the Blackwood brothers tended their fields, their cattle, and whatever strange rituals kept, their land green and their eyes unclouded, and though no one dared to ask what God they prayed to, everyone knew the answer would come eventually, whether they were ready or not. And when the sickness came, when the wells turned to poison and the eyes of the dying turned gold, no one asked why it spared the Blackwoods. They only watched and waited, and remembered the ash, the silence, and the promises that had been made long before Cedar Ridge was carved into the prairie. Ezra was the first to arrive in Cedar Ridge during the late autumn of 1872, when the sky was pale and bruised, and the wheat had long since died under frost. He rode alone on a dark-coated draft horse with quiet eyes and a saddle worn smooth from years of travel. He brought with him no wife, no children, no cattle, or carts or company, only a rolled blanket, a single chest of ironwood clamped shut with brass, and a small leather-bound Bible tucked into the inner pocket of his oilskin coat. The townsfolk watched from the porches as he passed, eyes tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone, the cold clarity of his pale blue eyes, the way his shadow stretched unnaturally long behind him. Despite the waning sun, he did not speak much. That first night only asked where the land registry officer might be found, and whether the northern pasture along the ridge had yet been claimed. By winter's thaw, Caleb arrived with a covered wagon drawn by 2 pale oxen and carried crates of tools, barrels of dried lentils and flour, and a thick stack of bound ledgers filled with symbols few in town could decipher. Unlike Ezra, who held silence like a shield, Caleb spoke in short, clipped sentences. Polite but distant, his movements were careful, measured, every step plotted, as if walking a blueprint etched beneath the soil. He asked about the town's water tables, rainfall cycles, the position of the sun during the harvest months. When questioned about their purpose in Cedar Ridge, he only replied with the same 4 words, spoken calmly, as if rehearsed 1,000 times before, to prepare the sacred ground. Josiah came third in early spring, and he came differently, not on horseback or by cart, but on foot. A long and winding journey through rain-slicked fields and storm-broken trails. His coat was heavy with mud, his hands blistered from carrying his satchel and books. He brought no food and bore a cough that echoed hollow in his chest, but his mind was sharp. Eyes alert, he stopped first at the chapel, where he stood outside for nearly an hour in prayer before knocking. When asked his business, he simply said, "I have come to help the broken prepare for what cannot be stopped," then turned and walked toward the hills where his brothers had already begun building something strange. The last was Abel, and his arrival was not seen but felt. Sometime during the summer of 1873, the school children reported seeing a figure standing at the far edge of the field, barefoot, hair long and tangled, humming a tune no one recognized, and staring at the sky for hours without blinking. He did not speak until spoken to, and even then his words came soft and trembling as if his voice were not yet ready for this world. Some said he slept in the woods at first. Others claimed they saw him digging with his hands at midnight under the old elm tree that rotted from the inside out within days of his arrival. When he finally joined his brothers on the ridge, he brought no tools, no clothes, but those he wore. Only a small carved wooden box wrapped in red cloth and held close to his chest as if it were a living thing that breathed. Together, the four Blackwood brothers built what they called the meeting house, though it resembled no chapel anyone in Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Constructed of pale limestone quarried from the bluffs west of town and thick beams of old growth. Oak transported somehow, without assistance. The structure rose slow but deliberate, every corner measured to exacting specifications. Every stone set by hand in a pattern that, when viewed from above, appeared to form an intricate shape that shifted subtly depending on the angle of light. Those who helped in the earliest days found themselves overcome by unease, sudden nosebleeds. Headaches that pulsed in time with a low hum, they insisted, came from beneath the foundation. After the third laborer vanished, last seen walking toward the trees with a blank expression and empty hands, the rest refused to return, and the Blackwoods continued construction alone. They held no services in the traditional sense, but gathered in the meeting house nightly, their voices rising in harmony, unlike any hymn known in the valley, the tones foreign yet strangely beautiful, like an old language remembered by the blood, and not the mind. Sometimes lights were seen from within, flickering and pulsing with no known source. Shadows danced against the frosted windows in patterns that left viewers unsettled and unable to sleep. One night, a young boy followed the sound of singing to the Blackwood land and did not return until dawn, barefoot and shivering, unable to speak above a whisper for days, and repeatedly drawing the same image in the dirt, a circle of four figures, standing around something he described only as the watcher beneath. The townspeople began to whisper of the brothers in fearful tones, not out of hatred but out of instinct, the way deer watch the forest edge before dusk. They were polite when encountered, always respectful, even generous in trade, but there was something not quite of Cedar Ridge in them. Ezra spoke in riddles at times and seemed to know things before they were told. Caleb kept detailed notes on every household's harvest, down to the ounce, though none remembered offering that information. Josiah could quote obscure scriptures not found in any Bible, and spoke of illnesses yet unnamed in any medical journal. Abel, when he spoke at all, asked children questions they did not understand and stared at trees as if waiting for them to move. Despite the unease, the brothers were not shunned but left undisturbed. Their fields produced with uncanny consistency, their livestock never fell ill, their tools never rusted or dulled, and their house, though exposed to the wind and sun, remained free of rot or dust or decay. When questioned about this, Caleb once replied, "Simply, we do not waste what the old law preserves." No one asked what he meant, not then. In the winter of 1874, a letter arrived at the post office, addressed in careful ink to Reverend Samuel Griggs, who had died the year prior. No one knew the sender, though the seal bore a symbol resembling an eye within a triangle etched in wax that shimmered faintly in the firelight. When opened, the letter contained no words, only a folded map of Cedar Ridge with the meeting house circled in black and a single line, written in a tight foreign script, which Josiah later translated as the gate. "Will open where the four are whole." He burned the letter after reading it aloud and said nothing further. By the end of 1875, the townspeople had accepted the Blackwoods' presence with wary tolerance. They paid their dues, helped when asked, caused no trouble, and yet those who spent time near their property reported strange dreams, waking in the night with their hands covered in soil or blood or both, seeing faces they did not recognize staring from the fields, and hearing voices beneath the wind that whispered of sacrifice, of reunion, of unmaking. No one knew what it meant, not then, not yet, but the feeling grew like a sickness without symptoms, an itch in the soul, a silence louder than any scream. Something had begun, not an event, but a slow turning of unseen wheels, a shift in gravity, a deep breath held across time and space waiting to be exhaled. The Blackwoods did not speak of it, but sometimes, When the sun hit their windows just right, one could see them standing motionless within the meeting house, their eyes closed, their mouths moving, their hands raised toward the ceiling, where a circle of symbols glowed faintly, even in darkness. And then the light would vanish, and they would return to their work, as if nothing had happened. But something had, and it would not be undone. What did they know that others did not? What had they seen beneath the soil of Cedar Ridge? What truth lay folded into the foundation of their chapel? What ancient hunger had followed them from Ohio, or been awakened here like an old god rising slowly? From dream, the answer did not come then, but it was coming, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. And when it arrived, no one would be able to look away without losing part of themselves forever. By the time the Frost returned to Cedar Ridge in late 1876, the brothers had ceased all contact with the town entirely. They did not attend market, nor respond to letters, nor acknowledge greetings when passed on the trail. Instead, they remained secluded, behind the black iron fence that now encircled their land, a fence that had not been built by any local craftsman, and whose sharp, curling patterns mirrored those seen in the dreams of the town's midwives and drunkards and dying men, patterns that twisted the eye and hummed faintly when touched, as if they carried a current deeper than electricity, colder than steel. The meeting house had grown taller, though no one saw the additions being made. Its roof now bore a second tier of angled spires, each capped with what appeared to be carved obsidian, or perhaps something older, something mined not from the earth, but from silence itself. The windows had been replaced with panes of smoky glass, through which no light escaped. And the central door was now etched with a new symbol, an inverted tree, with roots that formed the shape of 4 reaching hands, all pointing downward toward something unseen. No one dared enter, not even the sheriff, who rode out one morning with a pistol at his side and an old war Bible in his saddlebag. He was last seen stepping through the open gate, which had creaked inward on its own, as if welcoming him with a breath of cold mist. His horse returned at dusk, riderless, frothing, and wide-eyed, its hooves slick with blood that was not its own, and its saddle torn, as if by claws or by something sharper. More deliberate the next morning, the Blackwoods sent a small parcel to the sheriff's widow. Inside was his wedding ring, his badge, and a note written in an ink, the color of rust, that read, "He has gone to understand, do not mourn." The town changed after that, not all at once, but slowly, as though the land itself were turning beneath their feet. Children stopped speaking in their sleep and began whispering, while awake drawing circles in ash and muttering about the red eye that watches from beneath the floorboards. Dogs refused to walk north of the chapel path, and birds flew in wide arcs around the Blackwood property, as if the air there burned invisible. Every mirror in town developed a thin crack from top to bottom, as if something had looked back too long and left a scar on the glass. The doctor began keeping strange hours, and was seen digging behind his house under moonlight. With shaking hands, the schoolteacher vanished one night, leaving only a chalkboard covered in the phrase, "The false world ends soon," written over and over, until the letters bled into one another like veins. A fever swept through the eastern farms, one that did not kill but left those it touched with pale eyes, and a deep aversion to sunlight and the sound of bells and the taste of salt. Some families fled quietly, loading wagons in the dark and avoiding the main road. Others chose to remain, believing faith or stubbornness would protect them, though most stopped attending the chapel. After the third night, the cross turned upside down on its own, and the pulpit bled from within, as if the wood remembered what had been done upon it long ago. There were those who tried to speak with the brothers, to demand answers, to threaten them, or plead with them, but none returned. Whole one man crawled back over the fence, after 3 days, mouth sewn shut with threads of hair, his hands missing every nail, his eyes replaced by small stones of quartz. He died before he could write what he had seen. Ezra was seen once at dusk, standing just outside the meeting house. Watching the sky, his skin had taken on a pallor like weathered paper. His eyes now darker than ink, his hands twitching at his sides in a rhythm that did not match any clock or heartbeat when a boy hiding in the brush called to him Ezra, turned and smiled, and the boy would later describe it as the kind of smile a Vilf might wear just before it remembers what hunger is. Caleb kept to the ledgers, which now filled an entire room within the house, though no one knew what was recorded in them lines of numbers. Symbols, letters rearranged in ways that seemed to shift when stared too long. Josiah had taken to reciting entire passages of dead languages out loud during storms, his voice rising over thunder in tones that caused glass to ripple and veins to pulse in the throat. And Abel no longer spoke at all. He simply sat in the field beside the elm tree, which had rotted completely to black dust and now bore no shadow, only a hole in the shape of a man too long and too thin to be made by natural hands. Rumors spread that they were no longer human, or perhaps had never been, that they were keepers of something old that slept beneath the soil of Cedar Ridge, something fed by memory and blood, and silence, something that could not be named, but whose name echoed anyway in the dreams of those who had once held faith or doubt or fear. The preacher's son was the last to attempt communion. He left his home carrying a lantern and a silver cross and a letter addressed to his mother saying, "I have to know if God is still watching. I have to see if the stories are true." His body was never found, but for weeks after his disappearance, the town's well ran red and tasted of iron, and the old church bell rang by itself at exactly midnight 4 nights in a row, each time followed by the sound of footsteps on rooftops and the low chant of a language that made bones ache and windows crack. By now even the bravest townsfolk no longer spoke the brothers' names aloud. They were referred to only as the Four, or the Watchers, or the Gatekeepers, and their land was marked on maps with black X's. Are not at all visitors to Cedar Ridge were warned never to head north, never to follow the humming, never to answer when called from the edge of the woods, especially if the voice sounded familiar, especially if it sounded like their own. And yet beneath the fear was something worse: curiosity, the kind that grows in silence, the kind that waits in the throat, like a question left unspoken for too long. What had the Blackwoods found or opened, or become? What did the meeting house shelter now beneath its impossible roof? What did it prepare? For what dream or God or horror waited in the soil for the stars to align, or the right name to be spoken, or the wrong door to open? No one knew, but the ground was cracking, and the air was humming, and the dark came earlier each night, and the answers, whatever they were coming, whether asked for or not. By early spring of 1877, the frost had not lifted, and the soil remained brittle beneath the surface, as if something beneath it had drained the warmth for its own, becoming the cattle births. Came twisted bones fused, or absent altogether, and the mothers died with their mouths open and their eyes pointing at things no one else could see. The cornfields rotted before sprouting, and the river changed color slightly every day, now green, now gray, now the color of ash after bone has burned too long. Children in the western homesteads spoke of a man made of roots who watched them from wells, only disappearing when called by name, but leaving behind the smell of damp bark and something older, rotting pine or dead language. No one could be certain. And the fever that had once moved quietly now came loudly screaming through skin and making the tongue split into black petals. A girl of 12 choked to death on her own hair in front of the baker who never opened his shop again. Something was walking along the rooftops again, but this time it came during the day. It cast no shadow and made no sound, but its weight could be felt in the floorboards and in the skull behind the eyes, like pressure from within, as if thoughts were being rearranged while still forming. Several men hanged themselves in barns, leaving no note, only markings carved into the wood near the beams. A series of concentric circles, all pointing inward toward nothing. In town, the postmaster stopped delivering letters after every envelope began arriving empty, even when sealed by the sender and stamped by the station. A woman opened a letter addressed from her dead father, only to find her own handwriting inside. Spelling out a sentence she had no memory of writing, "I will not look into the hole again." The barber shop closed after the mirror refused to show anything but a long black hallway, regardless of angle or light, and the bank locked its vault when coins began to melt into each other, forming rough faces that blinked slowly when unobserved. The Blackwood property could no longer be seen clearly, even from the high ridge where hunters used to watch the spires. Now shimmered like heat on desert sand, and the fence line seemed to move subtly with each new moon farther out, closer in no. One could agree, and the sound that came from the direction of the meeting house was no longer music if it ever had been. It was like a groan caught in endless. Rewind, the breaking of something sacred looped over itself 1,000 times until it became familiar. More strange were the animals. The deer began walking on 2 legs in short bursts, not consistently, but often enough to unsettle, to suggest that something had been tried inside them, and nearly succeeded. Raccoons with human fingers were found drowned. In the creek, their jaws broken as if from within, a flock of sparrows flew in perfect square patterns for 9 days before falling dead in unison beside the schoolyard, each with their eyes plucked clean and filled with salt. The Blackwood brothers were seen together only once that season, standing in a line along the eastern edge of their land, facing away from town toward the mountain range that never used to be there, a new formation of jagged peaks that had risen from the ground without quake or storm, as though memory itself had misremembered the geography. Ezra stood in the middle, holding a book that pulsed in the light like skin over a heartbeat. Caleb held a blade that shimmered without reflection. Josiah's face was covered with a veil of woven hair, and Abel held nothing but still hummed, so deeply that nearby trees bent toward him without wind. Their mouths moved in silence, their lips parting and closing in, rhythms that hurt to watch, and afterward the ground behind them split slightly, revealing not earth, but a yawning dark. It drank all color. Even the sky above had dimmed by then, as if the clouds themselves had turned to watch, or to mourn, or to prepare for something older than season or sun. Rumors began to spread that time moved differently near the fence, that men who stood too long at its edge returned, confused their watches, cracked their teeth looser, their voices unsure of how to form certain words, like home or God or yesterday. A boy disappeared after leaning too far against it. Only his clothes remained folded and dry, as if never worn, as if waiting. The journals left by the local historian, before he gouged out his own eyes, spoke of a convergence, a ritual older than the land that had long ago been interrupted by the first settlers, who mistook it for devilry and built churches to bury its foundation. Now, he claimed the Blackwoods had uncovered it, and not merely resumed it, but improved it, deciphered the missing verses not through study, but through dreams and sacrifice and obedience to a voice that echoed in water and bone and mirror. Each night the meeting house bell rang 13 times. Despite no one seeing a rope or hearing a ringer, the sound was not just noise, but suggestion, bending thought and choice. Those who heard it too many times began to walk in circles, sleep beneath their beds, forget their children's names, and remember things that never happened. A woman claimed to have given birth to herself, and fled town carrying a bundle of worms that sobbed like infants. By mid-April, a second door appeared on the western wall of the meeting house, smaller, older, made of flesh instead of wood, stitched together, with veins that pulsed visibly, and a keyhole shaped like an eye upside down. Only the oldest residents remembered the stories of such doors, spoken in hushed tones before war, before country, before God, when things still crawled between belief and blood. The story said the door opens inward, not into the house, but into something else, into a beginning, not meant to end. And as the door pulsed, the town grew quieter, crops failed entirely, and the birds no longer returned, and the nights stretched longer than the clocks would allow, and the few who still prayed began praying not for safety or peace, but for erasure, for the past to be rewritten, for the memory of the brothers to be wiped clean, for the meeting house to sink into the earth with no grave and no stone and no voice. But it was too late, because the air had begun to change, smelling faintly of metal and milk and root, and the children now spoke backwards in sleep, laughing in strange tones that echoed into their parents. Bones and the water reflected not faces, but landscapes unseen, distant ruins on black hills, under violet skies, and the wind now whispered names no one had given, but everyone knew. And somewhere behind the door, within the hum, beneath the frost, something was listening, and something was learning, and something was coming, and it knew they had seen it, and it knew they would not forget. By the end of May 1877, the children stopped blinking, and their voices grew hollow like wind passing through old timber. They sat in rows inside the schoolhouse, but no one remembered bringing them there, and when the teacher, Miss Ellison, returned from her month-long leave, she found her desk filled with wet hair, and her own handwriting covering the walls in a language she did not know, one that pulsed slightly when stared at too long, like something beneath the ink was still alive. The preacher from Larkspur rode into town on horseback, with scripture nailed to his chest and blood leaking from his eyes, claiming he had seen the Blackwood boys walking backward through fire and speaking to a figure with too many limbs wearing the faces of the dead. He said the sky above their land had peeled back like skin, revealing not stars, but watching things with mouths too wide to close. And when he tried to pray, his tongue turned black and split and whispered without him, moving his jaw. Afterward he wandered out past the ridge, muttering about a gate made of bone and a library buried beneath the meeting house where the books wept when touched and the ink moved when read, and the names inside were not of men but of things older than men, things that should not be named out loud for fear they might remember themselves and return. That same week, the soil near the Blackwood farm began to hum at dusk, a low vibration that made the molars ache and the windows fog. From within, even the animals refused to pass through that part of the land, their bodies stiffening, their eyes rolling back and their legs breaking as if bent by unseen hands. People began to dream the same dream. Every night a long hallway, lined with mirrors that showed not reflections, but choices never made and regrets never spoken. And at the end of the hall, a door slightly ajar, behind which something breathed in perfect rhythm with their own lungs. Mrs. Altham, who had been deaf since childhood, claimed she could now hear, but only the sound of worms shifting beneath, the earth and the prayers of dying trees, and something deeper that repeated her name again and again in a tone that felt wet and sharp and wrong. Her husband found her one morning standing in the corner of their barn, eyes missing, tongue gnawed off, and the word listen carved over and over into the beams with her fingernails. The river that once ran clear now moved upstream against gravity, and while carrying with it the scent of milk and rust and old paper, and within its depths people claimed to see shapes of children curled inside glass jars and hands reaching upward that never breached the surface. The fishermen abandoned their trade after 3 nets came back, filled not with fish, but with human teeth, each tooth marked with a tiny symbol impossible to etch without breaking the enamel. The Blackwood brothers were now seen less as men and more as symbols. Caleb was found kneeling beside a hollow tree mouth stretched wide enough to fit his entire hand inside, and pulling from it a stream of thin bones that resembled no known creature, and yet felt familiar. Abel was witnessed standing motionless in the field for 3 nights straight, humming so low the nearby fence posts vibrated until they cracked and bled sap that glowed faintly and attracted insects never before seen. Ezra was last seen walking beneath the roots of the oldest oak on their property, not above them, but beneath, as if the earth had peeled open for him and welcomed him. Home Josiah began writing on the air with his finger, and the words remained hovering. For hours before fading, they were not in English or Latin, but something older that made the stomach turn, and the eyes water, even when not understood. One boy, who tried to copy the symbols, was later found in the woods, with his skull emptied and filled with fresh soil, and a single seed pulsing in the center. The church bells began to ring out messages that no one could decode, long sequences of chimes that seemed to follow the phases of the moon and grow louder. When someone nearby told a lie or held a secret or refused to remember what they had seen, some claimed the sound was not made by metal at all, but by bone, striking bone, and the air around the bell tower tasted of salt and old meat. A second sun appeared briefly in the sky, one afternoon, casting no shadow, but making every mirror in town crack at once, and inside those cracks, people claimed they saw images of themselves doing things they had never done, but somehow remembered. Clearly a woman embracing a dead child she never bore, a man screaming beneath a flood he never survived, and a boy cutting something open that looked like himself, but older and weeping and still breathing. The meeting house grew taller by several feet, though no one had built upon it, and its shingles began falling off to reveal not wood, but skin, pale and warm and damp, like something still becoming. People stopped approaching it, not from fear, but from a deep instinct that told them to look away, to forget, to pretend it had never existed. Some who ignored that instinct began waking with ash in their mouths and scratches on their backs in the shape of unfamiliar hands. One morning every clock in town stopped at 3:13, and the silence that followed lasted 13 full minutes. No birds, no wind, no breath, and those who spoke during that silence found their voices no longer belonged to them, but echoed with a second tone beneath it, as though something else was speaking too, something watching from just beyond the veil, waiting to be invited in. The library burned itself, for within books unreadable before now opened and screamed as their pages turned themselves. The fire burned cold and blue, and did not consume the wood, only the words and the knowledge within them. Afterward, the librarian could only speak in riddles and recited lines from books never written, referencing events that had not yet happened and deaths that had not yet come, until her tongue finally hardened and fell from her mouth mid-sentence. And still the door on the meeting house remained untouched, though now it had grown a second keyhole in the shape of a mouth, and a third that resembled a wound, and when people passed by they felt it, watching them, and some claimed to hear it whispering promises of return, of salvation, of clarity, that the world they knew was a lie, and that beyond the door truth waited hungry and open. Children began vanishing from their beds, without sound, without sign, only the faint scent of milk and old paper remaining. Their siblings claimed they went willingly. Some even said they were called, and that they would return soon. Different, better, necessary. One boy was found walking the road back from the ridge alone, eyes closed, lips moving in slow prayer. When asked where he had been, he answered nowhere, and then whispered something that made the sheriff vomit and the deputy shoot himself in the foot. The dreams deepened, now not just mirrors and doors, but vast landscapes beneath the skin of the earth, where cities older than memory pulsed with light, not of fire, but of understanding towers, shaped like screens, and roads paved with spine and bone, and language flowing through the air like water, touching those who walked it, and making them forget who they were or why they had come. And the sky itself began to forget. 2 stars rearranged themselves nightly. The moon cracked once, then healed in reverse. Birds no longer flew in flocks, but spirals, and the rain fell upward some nights, only to descend hours later with whispers. In it not noise, but memory, not water, but thought, and those caught beneath it remembered things they had never seen, their own deaths, their parents' sins, their true names. And at the heart of it, all the Blackwood brothers stood waiting, not moving, not aging, no longer boys, no longer men, but something else. Something old, something becoming something that had always been waiting for the town to realize what it had built. What it had ignored, what it had buried, what it could never undo. And now the earth beneath their feet pulsed like a wound, and the door began to breathe. By the first week of July, 1877, the insects began to change first in color, then in sound, then in purpose. The locusts arrived in swarms, but did not eat the crops. Instead, they lined the windows of the Blackwood house and tapped slowly in perfect rhythm, forming patterns that resembled letters, but only when viewed from certain angles, and only when the observer was alone. Their wings shimmered not with color, but with movement, as if they contained memories that didn't belong to them or to anything living. Children born during this time were different. They did not cry, they did not blink. They stared at the ceiling as if watching something vast and unseen, and when held their hearts beat too slowly, and their limbs moved only when no one was looking. One midwife claimed a newborn, whispered her name with her dead mother's voice before its first breath, and another infant disappeared from its crib, leaving only a circle of fine ash and a drawing in blood of a tree with eyes in its roots and mouths in its branches. The river grew wider overnight, swallowing its banks and uncovering long-buried objects, strange wooden dolls with nails through their eyes, ancient books tied shut with hair, a rusted cage filled with tiny bones, and a locket containing a photo of a man no one could name, but everyone felt they had once loved or betrayed. The local minister tried to bless the river, but his hands blistered and his tongue grew too large for his mouth, forcing him to crawl into the church and drown himself in the baptismal font, which turned black and cold and never cleared again. Night came earlier each day, but no one agreed on the time. Some claimed their clocks stopped at sunset. Others said the stars no longer moved, and still others insisted the sun never truly rose at all, that it only appeared to because they were meant to believe in light. The trees began to lean westward as if listening to something, and the crows circled above the Blackwood fields in perfect spirals, never touching down, never cawing, never leaving. The school children no longer played. Instead, they stood in groups murmuring songs without melody and languages their parents could not name, and when questioned, they all gave the same response we're remembering when asked what that meant. They would smile and say, "Ask the brothers, ask the door, ask the roots." One child drew a map in chalk on the schoolhouse floor, and when followed it led into the forest to a clearing that had never existed before, and within it lay an old iron bed soaked in milk and blood and covered in teeth, none of which were human. The Blackwood family barn collapsed inward, not with rot or wind, but as if pulled by gravity from below. Its foundation cracked open to reveal stairs made of bone descending into warm, wet stone. The sheriff sent 2 deputies inside. Only one returned. Days later, mute, bleeding from his ears, and covered in symbols that burned the skin of anyone who touched them, he wrote a single word on the wall before dying back. His eyes were not his own. They were round and too dark and too deep and seemed to reflect movement even in stillness. Voices began emerging from wells, from chimneys, from trees. They called out names in the voice of the listener's first love or worst fear or long dead kin. Some voices begged, others warned, a few only laughed and kept laughing even after the wind stopped. Some people followed the voices and never returned. Some returned hollow and smiling, with mouths full of soil and dreams full of fire. One woman hanged herself beside the meeting house, but her shadow remained swaying long after the body was gone, long after the sun had risen. The livestock grew restless, then silent, then wrong calves, born with too many joints, pigs with human-like teeth, chickens that laid eggs, filled with black liquid that hissed when opened, and whispered facts that no one should know about themselves, about the town, about the thing beneath it all. One man slaughtered his herd after finding each animal staring toward the Blackwood property, refusing to eat or sleep or die until commanded. Caleb Blackwood was seen walking through the cemetery barefoot, speaking to graves that had no headstones, and planting seeds in the mouths of the freshly dead. Josiah stood atop the schoolhouse and recited scripture that didn't exist from a book. That wasn't there. And when one man tried to stop him, he found his skin peeling in perfect spirals, from his fingertips upward, revealing not blood, but tiny blinking eyes. Ezra spoke less and less, and when he did, the ground beneath him seemed to breathe in and out, and the trees near him shed leaves that fluttered upward like insects. Abel walked into the woods with a mirror strapped to his chest, and when he returned, he brought with him a girl no one recognized, who never spoke and never aged and never blinked. He called her sister, but the family never had a sister, and she wept. Black tears that dried into powder and made men forget their names. When inhaled, she stood at the edge of every gathering, watching, waiting, humming, a tune no one else could hear. Dreams became unbearable. Some people began chaining themselves to their beds, or stuffing their ears with wax, or drinking until unconscious, but nothing stopped the dreams. They saw the same hallway, the same door, the same thing waiting behind it. And some began drawing what they saw, on walls, on floors, on skin, crude symbols of trees and wounds, and eyes with two, many pupils and mouths with no teeth. Some dreamed of waking, and in the dream saw their waking selves still asleep, and behind them something grinning with all the wrong features in all the wrong places. The townsfolk tried to leave, but the roads always bent back, the signs changed direction, and the horses refused to cross the boundary. Some claimed the sky grew darker the further they traveled, until they reached a place where light no longer existed, and the world behind them was no longer visible, and the air felt thick with breath, not theirs others. Who made it farther found themselves waking in their own beds days later, covered in mud and ash, and sometimes blood, with no memory of what happened or how they returned. A new sound began beneath the town, not a rumble, not a scream, something in between, like a massive throat clearing, like thought becoming matter, and matter becoming want. The ground pulsed, the trees cracked open, revealing red sap that writhed when touched. People began hearing the sound, even when standing still, even when asleep, even when dead. One mortician claimed a corpse spoke, a sound with its teeth tapping it in code, until he destroyed his tools and walked into the woods with no clothes and no name. One boy drew a circle in the dirt behind the meeting house and sat inside it for 6 days without food or water or movement, and when his mother tried to drag him out, she burst into flame with no heat and no smoke, only the sound of bells and echo. Scent like sugar and rot, he finally stood on the 7th day and said, "Only the gate is open now," and walked north barefoot, and smiling his shadow walked the other way. And still the Blackwood brothers stood silent near the door that now throbbed with every heartbeat in town, and still the people refused to say what they saw or admit what they knew, and the land forgot the seasons, and the sky forgot the stars, and time itself began to ache as if held in place by sheer will, and unraveling thread by thread, breath by breath, bone by bone. On the morning of September 3rd, 1877, silence fell across Black Hollow, not the silence of peace or absence, but the kind that presses against the skull from within, a silence so total it drowned the sound of one's own heartbeat, so complete it made the air feel thick like oil. The birds stopped singing, the insects stopped crawling. The wind itself refused to move, and in the middle of it all the Blackwood house stood breathing. Ezra Blackwood had not slept in weeks. He now moved only when the shadows did his skin gray, and flaking his eyes twin pits of reflection, in which some swore they saw their own deaths, others saw their mothers screaming, some saw nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. He no longer spoke, only hummed a single note in perfect pitch with the thrum beneath the soil, the note that made windows tremble and dogs foam and children bleed from their noses. Josiah spent his days walking the border of the property, tracing symbols in the dirt that never stayed traced. They moved on their own, slightly like water, responding to an unseen tide, like they were breathing. Some had sharp edges that seemed to cut light itself. Others pulsed when looked at too long. One boy dared to step across the boundary and was found. Days later in the churchyard, with his eyes sealed shut with wax and a message carved into his chest, "We are not meant to open what breathes." Abel had not spoken since the girl vanished again into the woods. Her name never known, her footprints never fading, they stretched across fields, onto rooftops, along ceilings, up walls, over the water. She never stopped moving, and yet was never seen. Walking, he followed them endlessly, now his feet raw and bleeding, his face locked in something between prayer and terror. He left notes, written in crushed petals and hair, and teeth always saying the same thing. She remembers the first door. The townsfolk began gathering in the church, again not to pray, but to scream, to bite their own arms, until the bone showed, to confess things they had not done, as if to satisfy something listening. They began speaking in tongues that had never existed. And when translated loosely by a traveling linguist who vanished days later, the words read, "He comes not from sky or sea or earth, but from what never was and always will be." The children refused to enter their homes. Instead, they lay flat on the ground, with their ears pressed to the soil, whispering stories of places. Beneath the basement, beneath the root, beneath the word, beneath the name, they drew pictures of staircases, descending into mouths of flame that smiled, of trees with fingers for leaves and bark that wept, and doorways carved from memory itself. They drew the Blackwood Brothers again and again, always with too many eyes, or none at all. At exactly 3:33, on the seventh night of the silence, the sky turned, not black, but bone white, and everything cast shadows upward. The trees bent backward, the grass shriveled, the insects returned, but flew without wings, hovered in stillness. And emitted a hum that turned the milk sour, and the mirrors dark. The door in the Blackwood basement began to bleed. Not blood, but something older, thicker, filled with bone fragments and ash and human hair. The brothers gathered around it, their mouths sewn shut not by thread, but by will, their eyes open too. Wide their skin, tight as paper their hands, interlocked in a triangle of flesh and intention. And behind them, the door pulsed with memory, the town's memory, the collective guilt, the unspoken betrayals, the broken covenants and buried sins, the unborn and the forgotten, and the thing that had waited not beneath them, but within them. It opened, not in the way a door opens, but in the way silence breaks, in the way a scream begins in the lungs of a child who has seen too much, in the way a god might weep when realizing it is not alone something vast and formless and old-filled. The house filled the town, filled the space behind, the eyes of every living thing. It did not enter. It reminded, it did not invade, it awoke. Those who looked upon it forgot their names, forgot their flesh. They remembered things they had never lived. They spoke languages that made their tongues split and curl. They knew things not meant to be known, things that had always been true, and never been spoken, things that made guilt feel warm and sin feel sacred and love feel like betrayal. The town began to rot from the inside. The trees wept black sap. The water turned to bile. The children stopped aging. The dead refused to stay dead. They walked not in flesh, but in memory and echo. They stood in mirrors, in corners, in dreams. They whispered. Backwards they fed on regret, and grew stronger with each lie denied. One man set fire to the meeting house. It burned for 13 days, and never fell. The flame was cold, and sang, when no one listened. The river dried, and beneath it lay another town identical to Black Hollow, but empty and wet and wrong, every window covered in skin, every house filled with ash, shaped like children. The Blackwood Brothers vanished together into the door, their bodies folding inward their bones. Cracking not with pain, but relief, the house imploded without sound. The land closed like a mouth. The trees stood straight again. The silence ended, And the birds returned but sang the wrong songs in the wrong order, and no one remembered the lyrics. The people who remained were not people anymore. Not truly. They spoke softly and moved only when necessary, and their shadows twitched when they stood still, and their reflections blinked late, and their dreams no longer frightened them, but welcomed them. They rebuilt the town exactly as it was, each nail driven into the same hole, each door hung at the same angle, but the wood bled when cut, and the bricks whispered when stacked, and the soil shifted underfoot like muscle. No one speaks of what happened, not in words, not in thought. They smile too often and blink too little, and every child born since hums in perfect harmony with the old note. And beneath the new church, buried in stone, wrapped in hair, guarded by symbols that twist when watched, the door waits again, not locked, not hidden, only closed, breathing gently like something asleep, but dreaming deeply. And the dream grows darker still.